Hey there, this is part 2 of 2 episodes covering the shiny Happy People docuseries on Amazon Prime. If you have not listened to the previous episode, go listen to episode 86 right now, and I'll wait for you right here until you're done. Alright, now that I'm sure you're in the right place, I want to give this quick disclaimer to let you know that today's content is not safe for young children. We cover some heavy topics, and I'm certain a few cuss words survive the final edit. I also wanted to let you know that we cover the topic of abuse, and I understand that this could be triggering for some listeners. Please take care while listening. In early June of this year, 2023, Shiny Happy People Duggar Family Secrets debuted on Amazon Prime. It reached more viewers in its first 9 days than any Amazon docuseries. And if you listen to the very beginning of this audio, you know this is the second episode in a 2-episode arc. In this episode, JJ Merrick and Christina Kalman continue their conversations with me, in which I ask them about the impact of Bill Gothard, IBLP, and ATIA on their life. I'm so grateful for their vulnerability. I'm Amy Fritz, and you're listening to the Untangled Faith podcast, a podcast for anyone who has found themselves confused or disillusioned in their faith journey. If you want to hold on to your faith while untangling it from all that is not good or true, this is the place for you. I don't want to give away, I don't want to spoil anybody on this, JJ, but I have a feeling there came a point in your life where you were like, maybe this isn't the thing.
Yeah, so we moved from Fort Worth in 1992.
Okay.
And we went to St. Louis. My dad got another job, so we went to St. Louis. He started working there. Was still working on his dissertation for his doctorate, and so we went to St. Louis for a while. And then in '96 we moved to Kansas City because my dad got a job. He had finally got his doctorate, and he was going to go teach as a professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City. So we had kind of moved away. Now, we were still involved in church, obviously. My dad worked at a church. Then we moved to Kansas City. He was working as an SBC institution. And so we were involved in church, but we moved away from that. Now, the things that did seem to stick was the dating and courtship and some of the music stuff. But it just became, we were just hiding it from mom was all it was. And we still listened to music. Like we still listened to all of it. We just wouldn't listen. Like in my teenage years, like I bought CDs and my brother had.
Did you have a cycle of buying things and then going to conference and then coming back and throwing things away, burning them, and then buying them back again? I've heard this happens.
We did, and you would feel really, there's guilt, like it's just guilt all the time. Like, my salvation, like I got saved at least 3 times. My first one when I was 7, and I remember clearly my mom sitting at the table telling me I'm going to die and go to hell. Like, you're going to die and go to hell if you don't make this decision. I'm just crying, and I was like, again at a centrifuge camp when I was 14. It's like, oh, okay, maybe that wasn't the best one. We'll try this time. And so church was always there. I was always involved in church, and my dad was the youth pastor. I was, and when your dad's the youth pastor, you're the cool kid because everybody knows you, and you're just at church all the time. And that just became it. And we moved away from kind of the IBLP stuff. We were still going to conference. I remember one year very specifically going to Knoxville and coming back and going to youth group at St. Louis and St. Charles and thinking, I want everyone to, because it was always this light in your eyes, your countenance, the light in your eyes, people can tell. And so I remember coming back from there thinking, this last week has changed me. And I remember ascending down the stairs into the fellowship hall and thinking, and like trying to open my eyes really wide. And I just remember this distinct, like, are they going to notice that my countenance is better? That the light in my eyes is brighter? Nobody did.
It didn't.
It doesn't really work that way. But we still went to church, and I was very involved. And when we moved to Kansas City, we could actually, I remember thinking we could actually choose it was the first time I ever could choose a church because we had always been chosen for us because my dad worked at them.
Yeah.
And so actually visiting churches for like the first time in my life and getting to choose my youth group. And I actually went to, a different church than my parents went to. And that was okay with them. And they went to the one right next to the seminary. And I went to the one that was down the road that I had more friends that went to. And, that was it. I moved away in 2000, got my first job in Nashville. So I moved from Kansas City to Nashville, and it was like, okay, what do I do with this? For me, my entire social being had been wrapped around church.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you leave that and you go and you're on your own, you're like, well, if I want any type of social thing, I need to go to church. So I ended up trying to find one. It was weird going as a 20-year-old. You're in that, like, you're not in youth group, but you're not in single adults. Some places have, the college and career groups. And I found a place that was Two Rivers Baptist Church. Started going there for a while. That all fell apart, but the church itself did. And then it just like, I just stopped going, and I didn't really, wasn't really a thing for me. And I just was kind of wrestling with like, what is that? And it just kind of went by the wayside. And it's like, I got married. My wife was, had the kind of the same experience. Her dad was a pastor. We met at seminary. And we had just kind of talked, and, a few years later ended up getting married. She moved down to Nashville, and we went to the Baptist church. It was right there, literally, we went to Creve Hall Baptist Church right here by our house. It was like one block over, and we got involved, and I got involved with the youth ministry there, and we started doing our thing. And it's like, well, you go to church. This is what you do. I played music. I got involved in the worship bands. We ended up moving over to Rolling Hills Community Church for years when they were over in the movie theater, and then when they moved to a new place, and we did church. Like, that's just what we did. I was super involved. I had a lot of skills. I did video. I do all these things, played in the worship band, and that's just what you did. You were constantly involved. That's your circle. That is your community. That is your social everything. We ended up moving to Spring Hill. We started going to the Bridge for a while, and then it was just like, we started that thing like, why are we doing this? Like, what is the whole reasoning behind this? And like, we literally hosted small groups. Like, I ran a small group in our, like, we were really involved. Even at the Bridge, like, we were hosting all that. And eventually it was just like, one day you just end up not going, and then the next day you don't go, and you don't go, you don't go. And then eventually we started to kind of reevaluate Southern Baptists and that whole thing. And I'd grown up from the beginning. I knew people in it. I knew all of it. And like, when they say Dynamo Southern Baptist, like, I was that. Yeah. I did every RA program. I did everything. And so, that was what was comfortable to me. And so we started to explore, and we had an old, one of our worship pastors at Rolling Hills. He had left and gone to start an Anglican community church in Franklin. And so we started looking at, like, what are other faiths? Like, what are other things out there other than Southern Baptists? And we started looking at Anglican and realized, like, this is a totally different way of looking at things. Like, I wouldn't say Anglicans are evangelicals. They're really not. And so when you take that, like, constant marketing of the evangelical, and you look and say, what does it mean to just exist and try to be good people alongside without trying to invite your friends at every element and try to go off and convert every person? What does that mean? And it became a much different thing. And I remember one of our first times we were sitting at Redeemer. We went to Redeemer for a while, and Father Thomas at Redeemer was absolutely amazing man. And he was like the one thing where we saw, okay, this could be different. And the one thing that hit me when we were sitting at Redeemer was the fact that the worship band played in a circle on stage facing each other. That it was literally their chairs are set up in a circle. There's no one up. It was not a concert. It was like, that's all they're doing. And, we started going there for a while, and then COVID hit. And then, if anyone knows the story, Father Thomas passed away in a car wreck a few years ago, and it was just devastating. And we haven't been back since. And so it's really just looking at, like, what is faith and what is necessary. it's hard for me because as an adult living in Spring Hill, Tennessee, if you don't go to church, you don't have a social circle. Like that is literally it. Those are the country clubs. Now I've found a little bit in that. I go to Burn Boot Camp and I work out. And so there is a community of people there that is very church-like in a different way. But you find that most people around here go to church specifically for that. Mm-hmm. And then and those things are, then it becomes this toxic way of the people who lead it have to continue it and keep it going. And then it just like, you have to be able to control those people and keep them. And so then that's when you just throw all this other stuff in to try to keep that.
Yeah.
And yeah, going back to IBLP, that's the exact same thing. They had to control them and you had to keep them going. You know, they needed them to have as many kids as possible. I remember the weirdest thing ever. They had the reversal baby choir that they would have every year. The children that were the vasectomies and the tube tying reversals that happened. If you were a result,
the babies that happened after that,
babies that happened, you would then they had a choir of them. I still laugh at that because all I can think of is Michael Scott and the snip, 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 snip.
So at what point did you realize not only were they a little quirky, something was going really bad, something was really wrong, especially when it came to like all the way at the top?
Yeah. I honestly don't think that happened until maybe even 10 years after my involvement.
You went to college, you weren't, connected anymore.
I mean, it's so funny because when we used to, there were a couple trips where we would go knocking on doors and hand out pamphlets. One of our experiences in a couple weeks in Indianapolis, we did that. And like we always wore, you saw the choir. That was our uniform everywhere we went in public. And so we had our navy skirts on and our white blouses. And we joked even then, like, oh, we look like we're in a cult. We look like we're Jehovah's Witness or Mormons or something.
Yeah.
And like we joked about it. So there was like this funny awareness of like, this is kind of strange.
Yeah.
But we just like brushed it off and this is a good experience, whatever. I think I don't remember when I first found the book called A Matter of Basic Principles.
Yeah, I remember that one.
I read that. I don't remember how that aligns with me meeting. It was a random encounter. Somebody came to inspect an office building that we owned, and his wife had been in ATI. And he noticed some Christian books on my husband's bookshelf, and they started a conversation, and they realized that both of us had been in ATI, and she had experienced more of the abuses. And so I don't remember having a lot of conversation about it, but I heard enough from her that I was like, oh my goodness, this stuff is really true. This happened, the abuses at Indy, that was the first time I'd ever heard of somebody being locked in a room, forced to pray for days. And I don't think that happened on any of my trips. We were too new, like the whole program was too new. And so some of those, whether you call it a system or whether those people just weren't in place yet that ended up doing that, I'm not sure. Then I was ready to say, that's a cult,
Yeah. And so that's interesting to me that your first reaction to hearing about it wasn't like, oh no, that can't be true. It must be just an isolated event.
I think we had said that too long. We didn't have any of the stories that are now being told.
Yeah.
And so for years we did say, oh, it's not a cult. A cult is a group that doesn't believe Jesus is God. They live like in a commune.
Yeah.
They believe that their leader is godlike. And there were many of us who did not worship Gothard. But there was, I don't know, I still think in part I was equal, had sort of this, I revered him a little bit. Like it seemed like he did know a lot about people. Like it seemed like he could read minds a tiny bit. And then I was also just a wee bit scared of him.
Yeah.
And I think that was some good discernment there, probably. I never wanted to be noticed.
Yeah.
When I was on any of those trips, I
You
never
didn't want to
wanted
be like picked out as like the next person to go to headquarters.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although the more I have read and listened to stories, it really feels like Gothard preyed on people and could really identify people that were vulnerable. So, I mean, the people joked about the young women, these young gals having a look that they look, there's a similar look that he liked, but it was deeper than that. A lot of them came from really troubled homes, and he would know all of these things, and really take advantage. And so I wonder if, it feels terrible. I mean, it feels terrible to say that you were lucky because you came from a family that was stable. It was a safe home.
It was, absolutely.
But like, there are a lot of people that bought into the system because things were just so very broken in their lives. And it was like, as much as we in the evangelical world, especially in the 80s and early 90s, would say we were not into the prosperity gospel, so much of the legalism really was prosperity gospels. Like, if you do these rules, your life will be better. Maybe we won't say for sure it's a promise, but it's a pretty big guarantee. And, just hanging on to those rules. And the idea that if something bad happened, possibly it was because we weren't doing the things right, or we were doing the wrong thing. We weren't doing enough of the right thing, or we were doing the wrong thing. It wasn't ever just like some things are just really broken in the world. His teachings influenced all of our Protestant evangelical churches. I think it was especially in the US, it was a huge deal. We joke about it now, like the umbrella of authority thing.
Yes.
And like, it seemed to make sense, right? It looked safe. And now, my friends are like, something is really wrong with that top umbrella if it's not working. If you need like 5 umbrellas underneath it.
I think those are some of the teachings that are sort of insidious, like, even though I didn't want anything to do with the ATI version, of what my young adulthood could have looked like. Rejected that early on at the age of 19. A lot of those teachings did continue to affect me. And, I'm kind of sorting through, like, I don't think my parents taught me this. Like, it might've been in some of the curriculum, like, but this came from those conferences, and this came from, and there was a little bit of like, you'd go home and you'd hear all about courtship. And I remember coming home and being like, so Dad, you gonna find me my husband, and I don't remember the conversation, but I can just imagine, because this is very dad-like, him being like, oh, I think you can find your own husband, like, I'm imagining that's probably what he said. And there was sort of this like, like, I thought that this was like the optimal way to find a spouse. So now I'm confused because all the stories that you heard at the conferences and, in the youth portions of the conference.
Yeah. I think it happens like that from time to time, where we read the books and then later on our parents like, I had no idea you read the book, and I had no idea the book even said that.
And they didn't make a big deal out of it. It's just like, no, that's not how we do things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I look back, like, the only thing I can do is like not put my children through it. Like I can be the chain, the brake. Like, for me, there was the rules that really stuck with us. Was the biggest one was the dating rule. And that is probably the one thing that I've struggled the most in my life. Was from the very beginning, you were told you had to court, you weren't allowed to date. And so there was just kind of this like underhanding thing of like, you're not going to have a boyfriend or girlfriend, any of that. If I had a boyfriend, that would have really thrown them off. But, not being able to do all that. And so you get later on in your, like, I left the house on my own, not having any idea how to do any of this. And just had no way of knowing how relationships worked, that like just even trying as a teenager, especially back in the 90s, that's what you did. Like, things are different these days with kids, and they act differently now, which is great. But back then, like, you found a boyfriend or girlfriend, and that was the way you kind of move through it till eventually you realized you wanted to get married and you kind of knew how to date and you knew how to do those things. I had none of that. And it was like, I remember the weirdest thing of my parents, like my mom essentially like saying like, you're never, you can't date, you can't do all these things. And finally I got married, and like the first thing she's like, well, when are you gonna have babies? Like, you do realize like my entire sex education was you handing me James Dobson's tapes and said, here you go.
Good luck.
Like I learned the birds and the bees from freaking James Dobson, which that's a whole nother thing. So like I'm sorry, lady, you don't get to be a part of this. Like this is not something that you may get grandkids, but that's all. Like you don't get to be a part of this. And that's probably the one thing I've struggled with my entire life.
Yeah.
It's been that whole thing on like how to date, what to do. And still affects me to this day, 43 years later. So
do you have a relationship with your parents, and are you able to talk about any of this stuff?
So my mom passed away back in 2016. And she got really bad. They moved to Kentucky. So my dad left Midwestern, was fired, essentially given a 1-year contract. So go from 10-year to 1 year, you know how that works. And ended up unemployed in Kansas City. And the only thing he knew how to do was manage restaurants, because that's what he did in the early 70s. So he literally managed the A&W / Long John Silver's 5 blocks up the road from the seminary. And bless his heart, he has his PhD doing that because he needed to feed his family that was still living at home. He did what he had to and finally was able to get a position in Kentucky at Clear Creek Bible Baptist College, which was absolutely over the moon that some former seminary professor would come to them. And he's now semi-retired from there, still lives there, loves it, has been there 20 some odd years. Perfect for him. They moved to Kentucky. My mom ends up in her just decline was pretty bad. Ended up in 2008 in a nursing home. And then she had trach, so she was in respiratory care, and finally passed away in 2016. My relationship with my mom was never good. And so we realized what she had done to us, and the way that she was, at that point I had realized that we were gypped our childhoods because of the fact that they weren't willing to ask for help. And thankfully there's 3 older kids, because so there's my older brother and me, and then my brother's 18 months younger than I am. So there's basically 2 splits, and then my sister and then the 2 boys. My sister and the 2 boys, they went to school and they ended up going to things. They went to college. Once they moved to Kentucky, they had played soccer. So they ended up kicking footballs. One went to the county high school, which was a 5A school. And then one went to the 1A school in town and played in the band and kicked. Both of them ended up football scholarships. One went to Western Kentucky on a full ride. And the other one went to Cumberland and then ended up as an attorney. Now he's a DA back home, married a hometown girl in Kentucky, loves his life there. Went from being he's now prosecuting. He switched sides. So he was a public defender, PD. Sure. And so he got to go and do all that. So I'm ecstatic for them, but realized that it wasn't until they moved to Kentucky, and Kentucky had a lot more social services available to them, and had help that would come in, and they allowed them to go to school and allowed them to do that. We didn't get that. And so I'm not bitter towards them. I mean, it's just kind of how that is, but I did not go to my mom's funeral. So I did not, my dad had 4 of them, actually. He basically did a tour with her ashes because they knew people all over. And so
wow, that's interesting.
He did a whole tour, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So my relationship with her, there was never really any reconciliation. I don't think there would ever been any reconciliation. The reconciliation needed to be me internally. I've had conversations with my dad. At one point, I think it was after my mom died, I had gone through some therapy, and part of that was you need to call him, you need to confront him and say, why did you not stand up for us? His reply was basically, I'm sorry. We did what we could to survive. It was all we knew to do. And looking back on it now, years later, I realized that's pretty much all he could say. I wanted him, but my whole thing was like, dude, you have your PhD. and you did nothing to fight for my education.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, I am where I am today because I learned it. I self-taught, but like as a programmer, I have problems because I didn't get algebra. Like I didn't have the math. I didn't have those things. So there are concepts I have really hard time trying to wrap my brain around in my everyday job because I didn't have those. And it comes really easy to people that, at least had basic math in high school. And I didn't even have that. Like my kids do stuff now. Like my 12-year-old's in algebra 2 and can do things I don't even dream. Like I have no idea how to do. So I did confront my dad at some point, and it was like, I'm really sorry. I understand, but that was all we could do at the time. We were just trying to survive. Like, there was a lot of things that were not modeled for me that I have to work through.
Now for a quick break. Not long ago, I made a decision that changed my life and my relationships. I started going to counseling, and I'm so glad I did. If you've been considering getting started with counseling, Faithful Counseling makes it so easy to get started. I know you don't like talking on the phone, so it's good news that you can start the process without even picking up the phone to talk to someone. The Untangled Faith podcast is brought to you by my listeners who support me on Patreon. It is also brought to you by Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling service with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, with access by video or phone sessions or chat or text. There are therapists with expertise in trauma, depression, family conflicts, and more. You can ask for a new counselor at any time, and financial aid is available for those who qualify. Untangled Faith podcast listeners get 10% off their first month from our sponsor, Faithful Counseling. Go to faithfulcounseling.com/untangled. Fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a counselor. That's faithfulcounseling.com/untangled. Now back to the show. How did all this inform your parenting? Because you cannot go into parenting without thinking about how you were parented.
I mean, in some ways, I think I'm still sorting through that. I think what happened is I felt like a failure a lot of the time. My kids were active. They weren't like naughty kids, but they weren't the types to sit around and read books for an hour or two. Or color even in a high chair for an hour. Like I've had siblings that have kids that do that. And I'm like, what kind of child is that? I did not get one of those.
You must not have read the right book and done the right things, Christina.
Right, exactly. Obviously, I did not read the Pearls book, and my kids did not sit quietly in a row. And so I think I probably struggled with, mostly I just felt guilt, I think. Like, I just can't do this. I can't do this good enough. I mean, and I was a stay-at-home mom. I had all the time in the world, to have my kids at home and to cook good meals and to keep the house clean. And it was still very much overwhelming because of my own expectations for myself and what I had seen modeled probably within HA, like this whole, stair step of all these kids sitting in a row quietly. How come I can't produce that? Well, thank God I wasn't abusing them. That's why.
Yeah. And one of the really sad things is some of them were being abused.
I don't know. It was just a progression of realizing that my expectations were flawed.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about having 3 kids that just puts you over the edge and you give up a little bit.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay. So what's second best?
Yeah. And I remember when you made the decision to no longer be homeschooling everybody. And you said your mom was really encouraging to you. Like she didn't shame you for that decision. Like she said it was going to be okay.
I definitely wanted to talk about that. I know, because homeschooling was, oh my goodness, it was it was a big deal. And especially in HA, it just felt like it was the only option. Like you're throwing your children to the wolves if you send them
government
to public school.
Yeah.
Yes, they're going to be brainwashed and all the things. And we got to a point that, I needed to work. I needed to make money. And also my kids had gotten old enough. Once I had a third that was in school, I realized I can't keep up, and I want my kids to have a good education. And so, a bunch of things kind of came together, and we sent them to a charter school, actually. Mitchell was in eighth grade. and Megan was in 7th, and Madison was in 4th. And they all rode the same bus together. It was an excellent choice for that year to be in a smaller school. They weren't so overwhelmed being dumped into, you know, all different schools, all different. That would have been overwhelming for me as well. So that was a really good choice. And it was good. And I did talk to my mom about it. And I was very scared. I was very fearful. I had never gone to public school. My husband had. But like, it felt like a system that I didn't understand how it worked. And so I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to guide my kids through their experience there. So there's a lot of insecurity on my end. And then I did fear some judgment. I have 3 sisters. Obviously, we all were homeschooled. And I have the oldest kids. My twin sister has kids 10 years younger. And then my younger sisters still have very small children now. And I talked to my mom about it. And she said, Christina, our hope is in Jesus. Our hope is not in our educational choice. Mm-hmm. And I think I cried because it felt like a burden was taken off of me. And I was like, yep, you're right. You're right.
But I think there's a lot of us that need to hear that. Like, our faith can never be like how our kids turn out is not really on us.
How old are our kids when we realize that? Like, okay, my identity is not tied to my kids' behavior.
So what do you think is the value of actually talking about these things? Because some people say, oh, this just makes Christians look bad. Yeah. You know, we should not talk about this. I would say, I think we should talk about it. What do you think?
I think so too. I mean, my first reason to talk about it, you know, there were so many years that, you know, the lawsuit that happened, and there were things that happened way back in the 80s. And nothing was done. You know, Gothard was not removed from
stuff with his brother and stuff
ministry.
Too.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, there's gossip within the community. Like, was it actually Gothard? And did he just blame it? You know, who even knows? But there was stuff, you know, that came out at various periods of time that just got squashed, and people were scared, and they were manipulated both spiritually and financially. And so my purpose is saying, you know what? Yeah, I did not experience the trauma, but I'm friends with some of the people who are on, there's another documentary coming out, and I'm not like close friends with them, but like they're friends of friends. They were on some of my trips. Like, I recognize these faces. And I know these names, and I have been in ATI recovery Facebook groups. You know, I was aware of Recovering Grace when it was developed. I was aware of when they were asking for testimonies of all the women who had, you know, some kind of inappropriate behavior from Mr. Gothard. Like, I was there present online. And though I can't say that I was there to see it, I was there to see enough to say, I believe these people. This happened. We need to believe them, and we need to do something about it and not let it happen again. So I think that there's power in numbers, and I'm just one, but I'm willing to add to the numbers. And I think just being aware that cults take lots of different forms, you know, I mean, there's lots of different types of groups, both within the church or within the business world. There are so many communities that are cult-like.
What are some things that you hope come from people seeing this?
Well, for one, I hope that there is exposure of these things do happen behind the scenes. And like, you know, this has been a long process, especially watching Josh Duggar's thing. And I almost feel bad for the kid. And I mean, he's a man now, but like looking at how horrible he was treated when from the very beginning, it's, you know, sexuality is shown as a certain way. You know, he then goes and does a thing that probably, you know, there was stuff that led up to that. There was things that happened up to that. But then after that, literally being told, okay, you're just going to go and we're going to ship you off. You're going to do manual labor and this should fix you. No therapy, no processing of it, but it was the hiddenness and the unopenness of what it is that caused him to have that they don't want to ever discuss. And then when something comes up, it's got to be hidden immediately because this is going to look bad on the family. What can we do to get this put away? And they thought, okay, well, that's all it needs to do. Well, then that just expands onto it. And he's got this already unhealthy view of sex that, led to, you go from, it starts with a porn addiction and then just kind of does, and you keep going and you keep trying to find something more and different. And then it leads to what he, with the SAM, it's like he was done wrong from the early on that led up to this. Now, sure, he should very well known that this is something he shouldn't have been doing, but that whole culture creates that.
Yeah.
And so, it's that hiddenness of it. Looking back now and looking and seeing like here's Bill Gothard, an unmarried, childless man, basically telling all these people to have as many children as possible. And here's how you should live your married life.
Yeah.
And nobody questioned it. It was, and I remember thinking it a few times, but it was always like, well, he's just like Paul. Like,
or Jesus.
Yeah. Jesus. True. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. What's funny is I don't even think about Jesus and all of this because I feel like Jesus is looking at going, y'all are a bunch of sons of bitches. So
that's a quote.
Like it really, like it's almost like, I almost want to separate Jesus from that because I feel like he's just kind of doing this the whole time with his head in his hand. Like, what are you thinking?
I think the trying to hide the broken thing is what makes things even worse. And
hiding was it, like, because it was like, if you have a child who is, quote, doing anything out of the ordinary, that is rebellion, and rebellion to them is literally listening to Amy Grant.
And it's shame. You get shamed over it. The parents are shamed. The kids are shamed. You're doing something wrong.
They talked about the blanket therapy, or blanket training. That was something that was very, very prominent. And for those who haven't seen it, it's literally you put out a blanket and you put the child on the blanket and you put something of desire, like a toy, and you tell them, don't go get the toy. The child goes after the toy. You then spank the child.
Yeah. And
you basically break them down. Like, I don't even do that for my dog.
Over and over again.
Like that. We don't even use negative reinforcement with our dog. We do a thing where we do a mat, but he has to choose to go back and forth. And that's how you do it. But like breaking the children, but literally that's it from the beginning. Break them down, make it where they realize that everything comes from above and that you are in control of nothing. And it just moves on. Mm-hmm. Women are not in control of their sexuality. They are not in control of their purity. That comes from the father all the way up till you're married. You're then handed over to your husband. You're literally not in control of your life at all. And so from that point, then, if anything happens outside of that, the hiding has to happen because it breaks the shiny, happy faces, the countenance, any of that, and I remember there was a couple years back where they had talked about abuse and it was the most grossest thing ever, but it was about like how God uses abuse.
I've seen some of that.
I think that it's like, maybe but the idea being is that it happened to you for a reason. That God allowed it to happen. And it's like, no, I can, as a human, take this and make it my thing because it happened to me, but you're not allowed to tell me that these things just happen for a reason.
Yeah.
But it's the only way that they can explain bad things happening.
Tell me why it's good for our faith communities to actually talk about the hard things and the real ugly, like, broken things. Why should we just, I hear this argument that says you are making the church look bad if you talk about abuse that's happening.
No,
tell me
God, no.
Terrible argument.
I mean, the church doesn't need to look bad. I mean, it does it on its own, but like the idea of like, we have to be open and honest, and we have to know that these things exist. Like, I worked in youth ministry. Like I left. There was time before I moved into computers. There was about a 2-year period. I went to Montana for a couple of months, out like the day that I graduated, and worked at a church there for a summer, and then came back and then worked at a church in Kansas City. And I worked under a guy who is currently in prison in Virginia. And he was a youth pastor, and he ended up messing around with a couple of his kids and ended up in jail. And, he was on, I remember eagerly getting the SBC's
list
or whatever. Here we go. Find old Jack down there, but he's sitting in prison in Virginia. So I've lived that. And what's interesting to me was they, in my interview process, I was like a 18-year-old kid. And I remember sitting at that table with the search committee or whoever it was, and them asking me, like, what do I do, about all these things, like to keep myself, secure because I'm young and all that. And, my dad had taught me, hey, don't be in the room with anyone. There's there's things you need to do. And he was smart. Don't give them rides by yourself. Don't do any of those types of things. Like, accusations can happen, but you just need to keep it clear and above. Okay, fine. That's great. And they're asking me when the real problem was the actual senior youth pastor who would later go on to do these things.
Yeah.
But nobody talks about that and trying to keep that up. And it's like, you can't have some of these people around teenagers doing these types of things without having a very open, honest conversation about it.
Yeah.
It's like, and this happens everywhere, like gymnastics. It's a problem. I'm a swim official, and part of what we do is there's a safe swim program because, you have coaches hanging around kids in swimsuits and things, like, things just happen. And so, having these conversations and making sure that there's things in place and that we make sure that safety is there is big. And we need to do that. These are humans. This happens, and we have to keep these kids safe, and we have to keep talking about it. And it's okay. Nobody's going to look bad. The thing that caused it looks bad, but let's fix that.
It's not the talking about it that's the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is there. Talking about it means maybe we have a chance to do something about it. We have a chance to do that. Like this, I think this is a moment we have a chance to either say, that's not us.
Right.
That's some crazy fringe. Or we can say, some of this is us.
And I think there needs to be a solid conversation about what it is about evangelicalism that causes all of this. It's like the conversation about Josh Duggar.
Mm-hmm.
We need to talk about what got him up to the point right before he decided to go in there with his sisters. And nobody wants to talk about that, of what is it that caused that.
Yeah.
This purity culture, all of these things is what's causing all of that. And, nip it in the bud, but you're going to have to nip all of it a lot of times.
Well, and things that are good are going to stand up to scrutiny.
Yes.
What's the worst thing that can happen?
Right. And it these conversations definitely do need to happen, and, changes do need to be made, but in realizing these things do happen and it's okay, but what are we going to do to fix it?
I like it. Well, I appreciate you giving me some of your time.
But yeah, I think the first that I realized that the message of Gothard was sort of extra biblical. Ironically, I had started doing what they used to call was a faith journal. And basically you just journal through, I don't remember if it was the whole Bible or if it was just the New Testament, but I remember getting to the New Testament. And I mean, I had quizzed on various books of the Bible.
Yes,
Matthew,
you memorized
Romans,
many verses,
I had memorized whole sections, or at least was very familiar with, whole books of the Bible. But when you read the Gospels, like all in a row, all of a sudden I was like, the rule keepers Jesus was mad at.
Yeah.
And he was having dinner with all the people that Gothard is saying that we should run away from, and these people will drag you down. And I was like, wow, I am a Pharisee.
Mm-hmm.
I came to that realization that this is not biblical. This is extra biblical. There are no keys to success. There is no special knowledge. Let's get back to Jesus. I mean, I remember I think I don't even know what circles, but I remember when I was still kind of sorting through some of the Gothard teaching, and when Jesus would be preached, like the simple gospel, I had this angst in me, like it's not enough. Mm-hmm. Like that came from ATI, mm-hmm. that there's this other information that's extra, that's better, that'll give you an even better life. And if Jesus is made smaller, that's never a good thing. And so I was, that was kind of a light bulb moment for me to realize Jesus is not enough in this teaching, and he is enough. He is absolutely enough. I think the church that we went to, we helped start it in Norwood, and that pastor, he just took everything back to the simple gospel of God loves you, love God, love people. And those are the building blocks. And if you don't think that those are enough, then that's going to lead you down a really ugly path. And I think that season was very healing for me. It just brought me back to a simple gospel. And I can't imagine, knowing where my life went. I can't imagine trying to hold on to some of the legalistic beliefs, even about divorce and some of those things, because obviously, my history and my family imploded. I had better teaching, and I could say, this is not my fault. Yeah. And also I lived in a community that had changed, that supported me, and I was not ostracized. I can't imagine that having happened, even 10, 15 years prior. Yeah. I would have been in a completely different place, I think. It's just so crazy. This random part of my life that ended up on Amazon, and everybody's talking about it.
I know this is hard to believe after 2 episodes, but I actually have more audio from our conversation. I share that with my Patreon community, so make sure you go to patreon.com/untangledfaith to check that out. I want to express my gratitude one more time to JJ Merrick and Christina Kalman. They shared vulnerably about something that deeply impacts them. As always, my hope is that you listen to these episodes and that this starts conversations you have with your friends in real life. So send this episode to your friends and continue this conversation. And if you're new around here, make sure you check out the show notes. I have linked episodes I think you'll be interested in checking out, including the series I recorded about our family's experience with my husband working for and ultimately leaving Ramsey Solutions, the company owned by Dave Ramsey. You can find those links on your podcast app or by going to untangledfaithpodcast.com and clicking on episodes. If you're on social media, I'd love to keep this conversation going over on Twitter or Instagram or through the Facebook page. I'm Untangled Faith on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm Faith Untangled on Twitter. The Untangled Faith podcast is hosted and edited by me, Amy Fritz. This podcast is made possible by the support of my Patreon community. A special thanks to producers Michelle Pionic, Phil and Susan Perdue, Pam Forsyth, and Shelley Taylor. Thanks so much for listening. I am actually planning on taking a brief break, so you will not see me around here, but I will be continuing to share bonus material with my patrons. So I probably won't see you next week, but I will see you soon.